There is a fundamental law of physics that dictates the reality of everything around us. Matter cannot be created, and it cannot be destroyed. It can only change its form. If you boil a pot of water, the water does not cease to exist. It simply becomes vapor, drifting into the air, waiting to condense and fall back down as rain. It is a closed loop, a flawless, unyielding engine of preservation. Now, apply that flawless engine to an entire planet. Imagine a world roughly 4.2 thousand miles wide. A world that, according to the most brilliant minds at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was once completely drowned in water. We're not talking about a few scattered puddles or shallow underground streams. We are talking about a colossal, violent ocean covering entire hemispheres. An ocean deep enough to swallow whole continents, churning with waves that crashed against towering cliffs of dark stone, and storms that raged for centuries across a thick, heavy atmosphere. This was the reality of our neighboring world, Mars, roughly 3.8 billion years ago. It was a blue planet, a chaotic, beautiful water world, arguably even more primed for the genesis of biological life than Earth was at the exact same time. But then, something went wrong. Something profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Today, Mars is a frozen wasteland of rust and radiation, a planetary graveyard where the atmospheric pressure is so incredibly low that human blood would physically boil inside your veins within seconds of exposure. It is a silent, suffocating desert. So, where did the ocean go? For decades, the scientific consensus was simple and somewhat comforting. We believe the water was blasted into the deep vacuum of space. We assumed that when Mars lost its global magnetic field, the solar wind acted like a cosmic blowtorch, slowly stripping the atmospheric water molecules away, blowing them out into the infinite dark over billions of years. It made sense. It felt like a neat, tidy explanation for a planetary murder. But recent data has completely shattered that comforting illusion. The math simply no longer adds up. When advanced probes from the European Space Agency and orbiters from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration began measuring the actual rate of atmospheric escape, the numbers were staggeringly low. Even if the solar winds had been stripping water away every single day for the last 4 billion years, it could only account for a tiny fraction of what is actually missing. The vast majority of that colossal alien ocean did not escape into space. It never left. The water is still there, but it is hiding. And what we are beginning to uncover about how it is hiding and where it is hiding is far more terrifying than a dead planet. It is a planetary trap, a geographic prison that redefines everything we thought we knew about the life cycle of worlds, and forces us to ask a very dangerous question about the ground beneath our own feet. To truly understand the sheer terror of what happened to our planetary neighbor, we first have to deconstruct our own minds. We have to strip away the comforting, everyday logic that we rely on to survive. Human intuition is a liar. We are born on a very gentle, very forgiving world. When we look around our blue planet, things seem to make sense. If you leave a glass of water on a table in the sun, over a few days, it slowly disappears. We learn the word for this when we are just children. Evaporation. We are taught that the heat of the sun turns the liquid into an invisible gas. It floats up into the sky. It gathers together to form clouds, and eventually, it rains back down. It is a perfect, endless circle, a system that feels safe. It feels logical. Because of this, we have a fatal flaw as a species. We naturally project the safe, comfortable rules of our own backyards onto the crushing, violent reality of deep space. We look through our telescopes, we see distant planets, and we assume they are simply larger versions of the world outside our window. We assume they follow the same gentle rules. This arrogance, this blind trust in our own common sense, kept humanity entirely in the dark about Mars for over 100 years. Let us take a step back in time, not millions of years into the past, but just to the late 1800s. Astronomers of that era were looking up at the night sky through long, heavy brass telescopes. They pointed their lenses at that rusty red dot, and their human intuition betrayed them completely. They looked through the blurry glass and they saw long, dark lines cutting across the dusty Martian surface. And because their minds were wired by the logic of Earth, they did not see natural geology. They saw canals. They convinced themselves, and they convinced the entire world, that they were looking at the desperate final act of a dying alien civilization. They imagined a brilliant race of engineers, slowly suffocating on a drying planet, building a massive, planet-wide irrigation network to pull the last remaining drops of water from the freezing ice caps at the poles. It was a breathtakingly beautiful story. It was poetic. It was romantic. It made the universe feel a little less lonely. And it made the concept of a planet dying feel like a slow, graceful fading of the light. But the universe does not care about poetry. The universe is a cold, unforgiving machine. When the 1960s and the 1970s arrived, we finally stopped looking through brass tubes. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration launched the massive Mariner probes and the Viking landers, sending actual machines across millions of miles of empty space to look the red planet right in the eye. What those robotic cameras sent back shattered our romantic illusions overnight. There were no canals. There was no dying civilization. There was no graceful end. There was only violence. They saw a crushed, radiated wasteland, a dead rock covered in massive impact craters and endless miles of freezing, silent deserts. It was a terrifying reality. But as the robotic eyes scanned the surface, they found something else. Something far more haunting than an alien city. They found giant, sprawling canyons that dwarfed anything on Earth. They found massive, dry riverbeds stretching for thousands upon thousands of miles. They found the unmistakable, undeniable ghosts of a catastrophic amount of water. The scars on the rocks proved that rivers had raged across the surface. Lakes had filled massive impact basins. An ocean had existed. The water had absolutely been there. So much water that it would have permanently drowned entire continents here on our own planet. So, the greatest minds on Earth were faced with a locked room mystery, a dead planetary body, and absolutely no murder weapon in sight. How do you kill an entire ocean? How do you delete a global sea from existence? Once again, our human intuition kicked in. We looked away from the dead planet, and we looked up at the sun. To us, the sun is a bright, warm circle that grows our food and lights our days. But in the brutal reality of astrophysics, the sun is a terrifying nuclear monster. It is a raging fusion reactor that is constantly vomiting out a relentless hurricane of lethal radiation and high-energy particles. We call this invisible storm the solar wind. Here on Earth, we survive this daily nuclear assault because we have a shield. Deep inside our planet, a massive core of liquid iron is constantly spinning. That spinning metal generates a colossal magnetic force field that extends far out into space. When the deadly solar wind hits us, it violently bounces off that invisible shield. We are protected. But Mars is smaller. Billions of years ago, the internal core of Mars simply cooled down. The planetary engine slowed to a halt, and the spinning liquid iron froze solid. When the engine died, the magnetic force field simply shut off. Roughly 4 billion years ago, Mars was left completely naked in the dark. It had absolutely zero defense against the nuclear storm. The theory that scientists developed to explain the missing ocean was beautifully simple. It made perfect sense to our human brains. We theorized that without a magnetic shield, the raging solar wind slammed directly into the Martian atmosphere like a cosmic blowtorch. Imagine standing in the middle of a freezing, violent hurricane while holding a cup of hot tea. The wind would instantly rip the steam away from the cup. Now, imagine that violent hurricane blowing constantly for 4 billion years. That was the official story. We believed that the solar radiation simply blasted the water molecules into the cold void of deep space. Day after day, century after century, the ocean was slowly bled out into the infinite dark. It was a clean, tidy explanation. It was printed in textbooks everywhere. We accepted that the Martian ocean simply evaporated into space. But in science, a good story is utterly worthless without the mathematical proof to back it up. If a planetary ocean is bleeding out into deep space, it must leave a trail of breadcrumbs. It is an unavoidable law of chemistry. Water is built from hydrogen and oxygen. When the violent solar wind smashes into a water molecule and breaks it apart, the normal, extremely light hydrogen floats away into space very easily. But there is a catch. There is a heavier, lazier version of hydrogen called deuterium. Because this heavy hydrogen weighs more, it does not get blown away by the solar wind as easily. It is sluggish. It stays behind. It sinks. Therefore, if the massive Martian ocean was truly blown away into space over 4 billion years, the remaining atmosphere of Mars today should be absolutely choking with this heavy, lazy hydrogen. The mathematical ratio of heavy hydrogen to light hydrogen should be astronomically high. It is a chemical fingerprint that cannot be erased. We needed to read that fingerprint. So, humanity sent a fleet of highly advanced orbiters, operated by both the European Space Agency and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, to constantly sniff the very top of the Martian sky. Their only mission was to capture the escaping gases and count the heavy hydrogen ghosts. When the data finally beamed back to Earth, the results did not just question our theory. The results completely destroyed it. The numbers, the brutal, undeniable mathematical calculations, were utterly devastating. Yes, there was heavy hydrogen in the atmosphere, but not nearly enough. Not even close. When scientists took the exact rate of a water currently escaping from Mars and multiplied it across the 4 billion years since the magnetic shield died, they hit a terrifying mathematical brick wall. Even if the solar wind had been stripping the atmosphere at maximum capacity every single second since the planet died, it could only account for a tiny, insignificant fraction of the water that we know existed. It is not enough water to fill an ocean. It is barely enough water to fill a global puddle. The solar wind did not kill the Martian ocean. It barely gave the planet a sunburn. This is the exact moment where all of our human intuition, all of our safe, comforting logic, spectacularly collapses. Think about the terrifying reality of this mathematical dead end. You have a massive planetary ocean, an amount of water so heavy it physically bends the crust of the world. And it is gone. The chemical data absolutely proves that the ocean did not escape into the sky. It did not fly away into the dark vacuum of space. The doors to the locked room were never opened. The windows were never broken. Matter cannot be created, and it cannot be destroyed. If the ocean did not go up, there is only one other direction it could possibly go. We spent decades staring up at the terrifying emptiness of the cosmos, looking for the ghosts of a murdered sea. We were so obsessed with the sky that we forgot to look down. We forgot that planets are not just solid, simple rocks. They are complex, deeply fractured, and hungry machines. The true fate of the Martian ocean forces us to stare directly into a very dark, very claustrophobic abyss. It is a truth that completely rewrites the life cycle of worlds. And more chillingly, it is a truth that forces us to look down at our own blue planet and wonder exactly when the ground beneath our feet will decide to do the same thing. If you seek the truth in the dark, if you want to unravel the greatest and most terrifying mysteries of our universe, without the comforting illusions, subscribe to this channel and join us on this journey. Because the Martian ocean did not simply evaporate. It was dragged screaming into the dark. To comprehend the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what is missing, we have to play a game of scale. We have to visualize a ghost that is so incomprehensibly massive. It breaks our standard frame of reference. When you lose your keys, it is frustrating. When a bank loses $1 million, it is a crisis. But how exactly does an entire planetary system misplace a volume of water so heavy that its gravitational weight literally distorted the shape of the world? Scientists at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration use a very specific concept to measure this kind of planetary trauma. They call it the global equivalent layer. It is a simple but brutal thought experiment. Imagine taking the entire planet of Mars, with all of its massive mountains and its deep, jagged craters, and sanding it down until the entire world is a perfectly smooth, flawless sphere, like a glass marble floating in the dark. If you took all the water that we know existed on ancient Mars and poured it onto that perfectly smooth sphere, it would not just create a thin film of moisture. It would drown the entire globe in an ocean measuring anywhere from 400 feet to over 3,000 feet deep, everywhere, covering every single inch of the planet. We are talking about millions upon millions of cubic miles of heavy, crushing liquid. This is not a mathematical guess. This is not a theory born from staring at blurry photographs. The scars of this violent water world are carved directly into the bedrock of the planet. And to understand the violence of those scars, we have to look through the mechanical eyes of the machines we have sent into the dark. Imagine the Valles Marineris. It is a canyon system on Mars that is so aggressively colossal. It makes the Grand Canyon on Earth look like a tiny scratch in the dirt. If you place the Valles Marineris on Earth, it would stretch entirely from the eastern coast of the United States all the way to the western coast. It is a gash in the planet that is 4 miles deep. When robotic orbiters scan the edges of this apocalyptic canyon, they do not just see dry rock. They see the undeniable, catastrophic evidence of mega floods. We are talking about walls of raging water, thousands of feet high, tearing through the rock with the force of 1,000 nuclear bombs, ripping boulders the size of skyscrapers out of the ground and tossing them like pebbles. The energy required to carve those channels is so vast. It challenges our fundamental understanding of physics. But the true terror of the Martian ocean is not found in the violence of the flash floods. The true terror is found in the quiet places, the places where the water stopped raging and simply rested. Consider a massive impact basin known as Jezero Crater, a deep, silent bowl carved by a meteorite billions of years ago. When the Perseverance rover, a nuclear-powered mobile laboratory built by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was carefully lowered into this desolate crater by a robotic sky crane, it was sent there for one very specific reason. The cameras in orbit had spotted a ghost from space. The edge of Jezero Crater features a sprawling, fan-shaped pattern carved into the dust. To a geologist, this shape is as recognizable as a human fingerprint. It is a river delta. Here on Earth, when a fast-moving river carries sand, mud, and rocks across the land, it eventually hits a large, calm body of water like a lake or an ocean. When the rushing river hits the calm water, it suddenly loses its energy. It slows down. And when it slows down, it drops all the heavy dirt and rocks it was carrying. Over thousands upon thousands of years, that dirt piles up, layer by layer, spreading out in a beautiful, fan-like shape. You cannot fake a river delta. You cannot create that highly specific, delicate fan of layered rock with a quick flash flood. You cannot create it with wind. You cannot create it with lava. A delta is a ticking clock. It proves, with absolute, undeniable certainty, that a massive, deep lake of liquid water sat inside Jezero Crater not just for a few days or a few years. That lake had to exist there for millions of years. It had to be stable. The environment had to be warm enough, and the atmosphere had to be thick enough to protect that quiet water for entire geological eras. And Jezero is not unique. The surface of Mars is absolutely covered in these silent, dry basins. There are dried-up lake beds completely covering the northern hemisphere. There are smooth, flat plains that look exactly like the abyssal depths of Earth's oceans. So, the water was there. It was deep, it was heavy, and it was stable. And as we established, the chemical fingerprints in the sky prove that the vast majority of this colossal ocean was not blown away by the solar wind. The heavy hydrogen proves the water did not escape into the dark void above. So, human intuition naturally pivots to the next logical assumption. If it did not go up, and it is not on the surface, it must be frozen. We look at the top and the bottom of the red planet, and we see brilliant white ice caps. Just like Earth, Mars has poles covered in ice. For a brief moment, scientists felt a wave of relief. Perhaps the mystery was solved. Perhaps the ocean simply migrated to the freezing poles and locked itself away in massive glaciers. It makes sense, right? If a planet loses its internal heat and the atmosphere thins out, the world freezes. The water turns to solid ice and waits at the top and bottom of the world. But the universe is an unforgiving machine, and it demands flawless mathematics. When the European Space Agency and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration pointed their orbital radar instruments at the Martian poles, they calculated the exact depth and volume of that ice. They bounced radio waves through the white caps until they hit the solid rock below. They measured every single frozen inch. The results were devastating to the frozen ocean theory. Yes, there is water ice at the poles. But if you were to somehow miraculously melt all of the ice at the northern and southern poles of Mars and spread that water evenly across the entire planet, it would only create a global layer of water roughly 60 to 90 feet deep. Remember the scale of the ghost we are hunting. The missing ocean was hundreds, if not thousands of feet deep. The ice caps are mathematically insignificant. They hold barely 10% of the water that is missing. Even if you account for the frozen carbon dioxide mixed into the ice, the math is a brutal failure. The massive, crushing weight of the ancient ocean is not hiding in the snow. This forces us to confront the current, terrifying reality of the Martian surface. We have to understand why the water cannot just exist as a liquid today. Here on our blue world, we are completely blind to the invisible force that keeps us alive. We call it atmospheric pressure. The thick blanket of air above our heads is incredibly heavy. It pushes down on everything. It pushes down on our bodies. It pushes down on the dirt. And most importantly, it pushes down on the water. That heavy, invisible pressure is literally holding the ocean together. It is forcing the water molecules to stay trapped in a liquid state. But on Mars today, that heavy blanket is gone. The atmosphere is so incredibly thin. The pressure is less than 1% of what we feel on Earth. In physics, there is a terrifying threshold known as the triple point. It is the exact boundary where the laws of nature begin to break down. Because the pressure on Mars is so incredibly low, liquid water is physically illegal. It is not allowed to exist. If you were to stand on the surface of Mars today in a spacesuit, and you poured a bottle of liquid water onto the red dust, you would witness a chemical nightmare, because there is no heavy sky pushing down on the water. The molecules would instantly panic. The liquid would simultaneously freeze into solid ice and violently boil away into invisible gas at the exact same time. It is called sublimation. The water skips the liquid phase entirely. It is a violent, instant erasure of liquid. This terrifying physical law means that there are no hidden puddles on the surface. There are no quiet streams hiding in the shadows of the deep canyons. The surface is a sterile, pressure vacuum death trap. So, the water did not escape into space. It is not locked inside the polar ice caps, and the laws of physics absolutely forbid it from existing on the surface. The scale of the missing mass is haunting. We are looking for an entire ocean, a volume of matter so massive it is beyond human comprehension. The scientists and engineers, staring at this impossible mathematical failure, realized they had only one direction left to look: down. If the surface is a death trap and the sky's a locked door, the water must have retreated deep underground. It must have fled the violent surface and buried itself in the dark. This idea spawned an entirely new era of planetary exploration. Orbiters were equipped with massive radar antennas designed to do the impossible: to look through solid rock. Instruments like the Mars Advanced Radar for subsurface and ionosphere sounding, an incredibly powerful tool mounted on a European satellite. began to systematically scan the entire planet. As the satellite flew silently through the void of space, it blasted long, invisible waves of low-frequency radio energy deep into the Martian crust. These radio waves travel down through the vacuum of space, slam into the dusty surface, and keep going. They penetrate the rock. They travel miles deep into the crust. And when they hit something different, something that is not just dry rock, the radio wave bounces back up into space and hits the satellite. It is like shining a flashlight into a dark, muddy lake. You cannot see the bottom. But if the light hits a shiny piece of metal, it reflects back into your eyes. The scientists were hunting for reflections. They were desperately searching the radar data for the signature of massive underground liquid aquifers. They imagined a vast, dark network of subterranean lakes, shielded from the freezing, low-pressure nightmare of the surface by miles of solid stone. And for a brief moment in time, the radar sent back a signal that made the entire scientific community hold its breath. Deep beneath the southern polar ice cap, miles under the frozen surface, the radar waves hit something incredibly bright. The reflection was undeniably strong. To the hopeful eyes of the researchers, it looked exactly like the radar's signature of a massive, extremely salty lake of liquid water, trapped in the pitch black under the ice. Headlines around the world exploded. We found it. We found the hidden water. But in the cold, relentless world of astrophysics, hope is a dangerous thing. As more data poured in, and as more powerful radar systems from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter scanned the same area, the beautiful illusion began to crack. The temperatures at that depth were simply too low. Even if the water was packed with toxic amounts of salt to keep it from freezing, the physics just barely held together. And worse, they started finding the exact same bright radar reflections in areas of the planet where underground liquid water was mathematically impossible. They found the reflections under dry, ancient volcanic plains. The shiny object in the dark, muddy lake was not water. It was likely a highly conductive form of volcanic rock, or ancient layers of dry clay playing tricks on the radio waves. The underground lakes were a phantom. Yes, the radar did find massive deposits of frozen ice buried under the dirt in the mid-latitudes of the planet. There are glaciers covered in thick layers of protective dust, hiding from the deadly low pressure. But once again, the merciless mathematics of the universe stepped in to crush our optimism. When you add up all the buried ice, all the hidden glaciers, and all the polar caps, you are still missing the vast majority of the ocean. We have mapped the surface to a resolution so high, we can see individual boulders from space. We have scanned the sky and counted the escaping molecules. We have shot radar beams miles deep into the crust of the planet. And the ghost is still missing. We have a planetary crime scene where the victim was larger than the continent of Asia, and the body has completely vanished without a trace. It is not in the sky. It is not in the ice. It is not in vast liquid lakes under the ground. We have exhausted every single logical, intuitive explanation that our earth-wired brains can process. We have hit the absolute limits of traditional planetary science. The water is gone, and it is hiding right in front of us. To find it, we have to stop looking at the planet as a container that holds water. We have to stop imagining oceans as distinct bodies of liquid sitting on top of the dirt. We have to look much closer. We have to zoom in past the mountains, past the craters, past the rocks and look directly at the molecular architecture of the stone itself. Because the truth of what happened to the Martian ocean is not a story of evaporation. It is not a story of freezing. It is a story of consumption. The planet did not lose its water. The planet ate it. When you walk outside and pick up a stone from the ground, your brain immediately tells you a very specific story about what you are holding. It tells you that the object is heavy. It tells you that it is hard. It tells you that it is a solid, permanent piece of the world. If you pour a glass of water over that stone, the water simply runs off the sides and falls into the dirt. The stone remains exactly as it was. It does not drink the water. It does not change. This is the foundation of our human common sense. We view rock as a closed door, an impermeable barrier that liquid can wash over, but never truly penetrate. But when you take that exact same piece of stone and place it under the lens of a highly advanced electron microscope, the comforting illusion of a solid world instantly vanishes. At the microscopic level, rock is not a solid wall at all. It is a vast, complex labyrinth of empty space. It is a microscopic cage made of individual atoms, linked together in sprawling patterns that look exactly like the scaffolding of a massive skyscraper. Imagine looking at a bustling city at 3 o'clock in the morning from a helicopter. You see hundreds of towering buildings, but the streets are entirely empty. There are thousands of empty parking garages, millions of empty rooms, and endless miles of hollow tunnels. The structure is there, but it is completely hollow inside. That is what a rock actually looks like to the universe. It is a structure desperately waiting to be filled. Now, we must look at the specific type of rock that covers the entire surface of Mars. The red planet is essentially one gigantic, dead volcano. The crust of the planet is made of dark, heavy volcanic stone called basalt. This stone is incredibly rich in elements like iron and magnesium, and these specific elements have a fatal attraction to water. Billions of years ago, when the massive Martian ocean was violently crashing against those dark volcanic shores, the water was not just sitting on top of the rock. A slow, silent, and devastating chemical war was taking place completely out of sight. When water molecules seep down into the microscopic empty spaces of volcanic rock, they do not just hide there like water trapped in a sponge. A sponge is harmless. If you squeeze a sponge, the water comes back out exactly as it went in. What happens inside the rock is entirely different. It is a violent physical destruction. The iron and magnesium inside the stone reach out and literally tear the water molecule apart. The hydrogen and oxygen are physically separated from each other, and they are violently forced to lock into the microscopic architecture of the rock itself. The water loses its identity completely. It is no longer a liquid that can flow. It is no longer a gas that can float away. It becomes a fundamental structural piece of the stone. The water physically turns into rock. Scientists call this process mineral hydration. But that is a very clean, academic term for a process that is essentially a planetary trap. It is a one-way street. Once the water is broken apart and fused into the crystal scaffolding of the stone, it is imprisoned. It is locked in the dark, completely invisible to the outside world. If you were to hold a piece of this deeply hydrated Martian rock in your hand today, it would feel completely dry to the touch. You could bake it in the hot sun and not a single drop of moisture would appear on the surface. To the human eye, it is just a dead, dusty red stone. But chemically, up to 10% of the massive weight of that dry rock is made entirely of the ghosts of the ancient ocean. But this terrifying chemical trap instantly creates a massive, glaring paradox for the scientists trying to solve the mystery. Because if volcanic rock naturally destroys water by turning it into stone, why in the world is Earth still blue? Our home planet is made of the exact same cosmic dirt as Mars. The bottom of our deep oceans is entirely paved with thousands of miles of heavy, dark volcanic basalt. We have had massive global oceans pressing down on this rock for over 4 billion years. The water is constantly seeping into the deep trenches, and the rock is constantly absorbing it and tearing the molecules apart. By the strict laws of chemistry, Earth should have eaten its own ocean billions of years ago. Our planet should be a dry, dead desert. But we are not. The water is still here. To understand why Earth survived and why Mars was completely devoured, we have to look past the chemistry of the stone and look deep into the beating heart of the planet itself. Earth is not a dead rock. It is a highly active, violent industrial engine. Deep beneath the ground you walk on, the core of our planet is a swirling hellscape of liquid iron. It is a nuclear furnace that generates an incomprehensible amount of heat. That massive internal heat creates a violent, churning ocean of molten rock deep under the crust. Because of this intense underground chaos, the solid surface of Earth is not actually one solid piece of rock. It is cracked. It is broken into massive plates that are constantly, violently grinding against each other. We call this plate tectonics. This cracked crust is the ultimate planetary recycling machine. It is a colossal, global conveyor belt that saves our lives every single day. As the bottom of the deep ocean absorbs the water and turns it into hydrated stone, the tectonic conveyor belt slowly drags that heavy, water-choked rock down into the dark trenches. It is pulled deeper and deeper into the planet until it hits the raging heat of the deep mantle. When that hydrated rock is pushed into the extreme liquid fire of the deep Earth, the intense heat acts like a master key. It violently shatters the microscopic cage. The chemical bonds are broken, the rock melts into magma, and the trapped water is suddenly set free, because water expands when it turns to hot steam. The pressure under the ground builds to catastrophic levels. The steam violently pushes its way back up through the cracks in the world and explodes back onto the surface through massive volcanic eruptions. This is the hidden half of the water cycle that we are never taught in school. We are taught that water goes from the ocean to the clouds and back to the ocean. But the true cycle is far deeper. The water goes from the ocean into the deep rock, down into the fires of the mantle, and is blasted back into the sky by volcanoes. It is a perfect, flawless loop, a permanent, planet-wide engine of resurrection. The rock eats the water, and the fire forces the rock to spit it back out. Now, let us take that flawless recycling machine and look at Mars. Mars is a small world. It is roughly half the physical size of Earth. Because of this small size, the internal nuclear furnace of the red planet simply could not sustain its heat in the freezing void of deep space. Billions of years ago, while the massive ocean was still raging on the surface, the heart of Mars began to fail. The liquid iron deep inside the planet slowly began to cool down. The violent churning of the deep rock slowed to a crawl, and eventually, the internal heat simply died. When the core froze, the massive tectonic conveyor belt ground to a permanent halt. The surface of the planet stopped moving. The cracks sealed shut. The volcanoes went dark and silent. The beating heart of the world stopped. But the dark, volcanic rock on the surface, the massive sponge covering the entire planet, did not stop working. The chemistry of the stone does not care if the planetary engine is dead. The ancient ocean continued to press down on the volcanic crust. The water continued to seep into the microscopic labyrinth of the rock. The iron and magnesium continued to violently tear the water molecules apart, trapping them in the scaffolding of the stone. The rock kept eating the ocean every single day for millions upon millions of years. But because the tectonic conveyor belt was broken, the water-choked rock was never dragged down into the fire. It was never melted. The chemical bonds were never broken. The water had no escape route. It was a catastrophic one-way ticket. The flawless loop was severed. Without the fire of the volcanoes to release the steam back into the sky, the massive Martian ocean simply bled out into the dirt. Drop by drop, gallon by gallon, cubic mile by cubic mile, the water was swallowed by the dark stone. The atmosphere grew thinner and colder. The pressure dropped. Whatever liquid water was left on the surface was forced to evaporate or freeze. But the vast majority of that colossal weight was already gone. It was pulled down into the dark. This is the paradox that completely haunted the engineers and scientists at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. They spent decades looking at the sky. They spent billions of dollars launching advanced satellites to hunt for the escaping gases of a murdered ocean. They assumed that the violent environment of deep space had killed the planet. They never realized that the call was coming from inside the house. The planet was not murdered by the sun. It was not stripped away by the solar wind. The planet committed a slow, silent suicide. The very rock that created the ocean basins, the very rock that provided the foundation for a potential biological paradise, was the exact same mechanism that devoured it whole. To prove this terrifying theory, scientists could not rely on pictures from orbit. They needed to touch the dead rock itself. They needed to force the stone to confess. So, they sent the rovers, nuclear-powered mobile laboratories the size of cars, dropped onto the alien dirt by supersonic parachutes and rocket-powered sky cranes. When the Curiosity rover began driving across the desolate floor of Gale Crater, it did not just look at the rocks. It attacked them. The rover is equipped with a highly advanced instrument called the Chemistry and Camera Complex. It is essentially a powerful laser beam. The rover slowly drives up to a dry, dusty rock and fires a pulse of pure energy at the stone. The laser is so intensely hot, it instantly vaporizes a tiny pinprick of the rock, turning the solid stone into a brief flash of glowing plasma. By analyzing the exact color of that glowing spark, the computers on Earth can determine exactly what atoms were trapped inside the microscopic cage. Over and over again, across miles of the dead planetary surface, the rover fired its laser into the dark rocks. And over again, the glowing sparks sent back the exact same undeniable chemical fingerprint: hydrogen, oxygen. The ghosts of the ancient water were everywhere. The very dust that coats the wheels of the rover is made of shattered, hydrated minerals. The entire crust of the planet, stretching miles down into the dark, is absolutely saturated with the remains of the dead ocean. When scientists took the chemical data from the laser strikes and combined it with the massive volume of the Martian crust, the mathematics finally aligned. The numbers were no longer a failure. They calculated that a staggering 30 to 99% of the entire original ocean is currently locked inside the crystal lattice of the dirt. It is an almost incomprehensible volume of trapped material. The water did not go anywhere. It is sitting right there. It is the very ground the rovers are driving on. It is the towering walls of the massive canyons. It is the dust blowing in the thin, freezing wind. The ocean is not missing. We are just looking at its corpse. This realization creates an overwhelming sense of scientific frustration. It is a feeling of standing in front of a locked vault that holds the greatest treasure in the solar system. But knowing that the key was thrown into the fire 4 billion years ago. Because even though we know exactly where the water is, it is completely useless to us. If human beings ever travel to Mars, if we ever try to build a permanent outpost on that freezing red rock, we cannot just drill a hole in the ground and pump the water out. We cannot just melt the dirt. To extract the water from the hydrated minerals, to break that microscopic cage, requires an extreme amount of industrial heat and energy. You would have to strip mine the surface of the planet, shovel millions of tons of red dirt into massive mechanical ovens, and bake the rock at incredibly high temperatures just to release a few drops of usable steam. The planet has locked its resources away behind an impenetrable wall of chemistry. We spent over a century looking at Mars and projecting our own safe, earthbound intuition onto it. We imagined grand canals and dying civilizations because we wanted to see ourselves in the dark. Even when the robotic eyes proved that the planet was a dead wasteland, we still desperately tried to force our own logic onto the crime scene. We assumed the water blew away like steam from a hot cup of tea. We assumed it froze at the poles like our own Arctic ice. We completely failed to grasp the sheer, unfeeling mechanics of a world that lacks a beating heart. We failed to understand that an ocean is not a permanent fixture of a planet. It is a delicate, fragile balance of forces. It is a continuous negotiation between the heat of the deep interior, the chemistry of the rocks, and the invisible weight of the sky. If any single part of that massive machine breaks down, the entire system collapses into ruin. And when we finally solved the mathematics, when the laser beams and the orbital data finally proved exactly what the rock had done, it fundamentally shifted how we view the life cycle of every single world in the cosmos. Because if the dark volcanic rock on Mars was capable of swallowing a global ocean, turning it into dry, dead dust, then it forces us to confront a terrifying reality about the nature of habitability. We are constantly scanning the night sky with massive telescopes, hunting for a second Earth. We look for planets in the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold. Just the right distance from their star to allow liquid water to exist on the surface. We assume that if we find a rock with an ocean, we have found a potential home. But the silent tragedy of Mars proves that distance from the sun is not enough. A warm orbit is not enough. A planet can have the perfect temperature. It can have a massive global ocean. It can have the chemical building blocks for biological life. But if it is too small, if its internal engine cools down and the tectonic conveyor belt stops moving, that planet is on a silent, inescapable countdown to death. The ground will simply open up and consume the water. This brings us to a deeply claustrophobic realization about the ground beneath our own feet. We live on a blue marble. We feel safe because our internal tectonic engine is still violently spinning. The volcanoes are still erupting. The conveyor belt is still pushing the water back out into the sky. But the laws of thermodynamics are absolute. Heat cannot be trapped forever. Very slowly, over millions upon millions of years, the intense nuclear fire deep inside the core of the Earth is cooling down. It is a mathematical certainty. The liquid iron is slowly freezing. The churning engine is losing its energy. We are walking on top of a machine that is inevitably running out of fuel. And when the heart of the Earth finally stops beating, when the tectonic plates grind to a halt and lock themselves into place forever, the dark volcanic rock at the bottom of our deep blue oceans will not stop eating. The water will continue to seep into the microscopic cracks of the deep ocean floor. The iron will continue to break the molecules apart. And without the fire to push the steam back out, the Earth will eventually begin to slowly, silently swallow its own seas. We are looking at the dusty, rusted surface of Mars, not just as a dead neighbor in the dark. We are looking at a mirror. We are looking at a flawless, undeniable preview of exactly what is going to happen to us. The greatest and most dangerous trick the universe ever played on human beings is our perception of time. We measure the reality of the cosmos using the biological clock of our own bodies. A human being lives for roughly 80 years because our window of existence is so incredibly tiny. We look at a mountain and we think it is a permanent, unmoving fixture of the world. We look at a vast blue ocean and we assume it has always been there and will always be there. But the universe does not operate on human time. The universe operates on deep geological time, a timescale so vast and so terrifying that it renders human history completely invisible. When you step back and view a planet not over hundreds of years, but over billions of years, the illusion of permanence completely shatters. A mountain is no longer a solid object. It is a slow-moving wave of dirt rising and falling. A continent is just a raft drifting across a sea of boiling rock, and an ocean. Even an ocean that is thousands of feet deep and covers an entire hemisphere is just a temporary puddle waiting to be absorbed. The discovery that Mars literally consumed its own water forces us to completely rip up the textbook on how we view the cosmos. It forces us to realize that planets are not just passive rocks orbiting a star. They are biological machines. They are massive, self-contained engines. And just like any engine, they require fuel to run. For decades, the brilliant astronomers at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the European Space Agency have been staring into the deep dark of the galaxy, hunting for a second Earth. They have discovered thousands of exoplanets orbiting distant alien suns. When they find a planet, they immediately check to see if it sits in a very specific, very narrow band of space around its star. We call this the Goldilocks zone. It is the exact mathematical distance where the heat from the star is perfectly balanced. Not too close. Or the water boils away into vapor. Not too far. Or the water freezes into solid ice. If a planet sits right in the middle of that zone, where liquid water can comfortably exist on the surface, we celebrate. We color it blue in our computer models. We imagine it as a lush, habitable paradise waiting to be explored. We project our hopes and our desperate need for company onto a distant speck of light. But the silent, dusty graveyard of Mars proves that our entire strategy is fundamentally flawed. The Goldilocks zone is a lie. Or at the very least, it is only half of the truth. Mars is inside the Goldilocks zone. It is bathed in the exact same life-giving sunlight that we are. By all the simple rules of distance and temperature, it should be a thriving water world today. But it is a dead, toxic desert. Because distance from the sun does not matter if the internal engine of the planet is dead. Think of a planet like a highly advanced mobile phone. You can hold that phone in the perfect lighting. You can place it in the perfect environment. You can have the most beautiful glass screen and the most complex internal wiring. But if the battery inside is dead, the screen is black. The phone is just a useless brick of metal and glass. The liquid iron core spinning deep inside a planet is the battery. It is the only thing generating the heat, the movement, and the magnetic shield required to keep the world alive. When we look at those thousands of distant exoplanets sitting in the perfect habitable zone, we are entirely blind to their internal batteries. We cannot see if their cores are still spinning with liquid fire, or if they have frozen solid in the dark. This means that out there in the infinite black, there could be millions of planets that look perfectly positioned for life. Millions of planets that once held deep, beautiful oceans. But because they were simply too small to hold on to their internal heat, their batteries died. Their tectonic plates locked into place, and their dark volcanic crusts quietly swallowed their oceans whole. The galaxy is likely filled with these silent, mummified water worlds, planets that committed slow geological suicide. It is a terrifyingly lonely thought. We might be looking at a universe populated mostly by planetary corpses that ate their own potential for life. And perhaps the most haunting part of this entire process is how incredibly slow it is. When a planet dies, it is not a sudden, dramatic explosion. It is not an action movie. It is an agonizingly slow, suffocating fade to black. Imagine being a theoretical microscopic organism living in the massive Martian ocean 3.8 billion years ago. The sky is thick, the water is warm, the environment is perfect. But deep beneath the rocky floor of your ocean, the planetary core begins to cool. The heat starts to drop. The invisible magnetic shield in the sky slowly begins to thin out. At first, nothing changes. The ocean still crashes against the cliffs. The rivers still flow. But over millions of years, the rock at the bottom of the ocean simply does not stop eating the water. Gallon by gallon, the sea level begins to drop. It is so slow that no single generation of life would ever notice it. It is like the latency of a massive global server, a slow lag creeping into the system, degrading the connection bit by bit. As the tectonic conveyor belt stops pushing the steam back into the sky, the atmosphere gets thinner. The clouds vanish, the temperature plummets, the massive global ocean fractures. It breaks apart into isolated, salty lakes. The water retreats into the deepest impact craters, like puddles slowly drying in a parking lot. Whatever life existed there would have been forced to retreat. It would have desperately chased the remaining water, moving deeper and deeper underground, seeking the last remaining pockets of warmth from the dying core. They were trapped in a collapsing house, watching the ceiling slowly lower every single millennium. Eventually, the pressure dropped so incredibly low that the surface became a death zone. The final scattered lakes violently boiled into vapor or froze into permanent ice. The dark rock consumed the rest. The doors locked, the lights went out, and the planet has sat in absolute freezing silence for billions of years since. This is not just the story of an alien world millions of miles away. This is a story about the fundamental mechanics of reality. It is a mechanical law that governs every single piece of rock floating in the void, including ours. Humanity has built its entire civilization on the absolute arrogance that Earth is a permanent sanctuary. We build our massive concrete cities on the coastlines. We draw our maps with permanent borders. We assume that the blue of the ocean and the green of the land are fixed, eternal colors on the canvas of the universe. But Earth is a machine. It is a much larger machine than Mars, with a much larger battery, but it is still just a machine. And the brutal, relentless laws of thermodynamics dictate that heat always dissipates. It cannot be contained forever. Deep beneath the green grass and the blue waves, the nuclear fire at the center of the Earth is slowly burning out. Every single day, our planet bleeds an invisible, massive amount of heat out into the freezing vacuum of space. It is a mathematical certainty. It is not a theory. It is a timer ticking down in the dark. Far in the deep future, millions or perhaps billions of years from now, the liquid iron core of Earth will inevitably cool. The engine will begin to sputter. The massive tectonic plates that move our continents will lose their driving force. They will slow down, and eventually, they will grind to a permanent halt. The volcanoes will stop erupting. The deep ocean trenches will stop recycling the rock. When the heart of the Earth finally freezes, our protective magnetic shield will collapse. But the dark, heavy volcanic stone that lines the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Indian Ocean will still be there, and it will still be hungry. The water will continue to seep into the microscopic cracks of the deep ocean floor. The iron and magnesium will continue to violently tear the water molecules apart, locking the hydrogen and oxygen into the solid crystal structure of the planet. But there will be no volcanic fire left to push the water back out. Earth will begin to drink its own oceans. Over millions of years, the sea levels will slowly drop. The massive coral reefs will be exposed to the dying air. The continental shelves will become vast, dry deserts of salt and dust. The deep blue surface of our world will slowly recede, leaving behind a fractured, dying landscape. As the ocean drains into the stone, the atmosphere will thin out. The clouds will vanish. The blue sky will turn into a deep, dark, radiation-soaked violet. Earth will look exactly like Mars, a mummified corpse of a water world, holding the ghosts of its oceans perfectly preserved inside its own dry rock. This is the hidden consequence of the data sent back by our robotic rovers. We spent billions of dollars building rockets and lasers to solve a locked room mystery on a dead planet. We wanted to know who killed the Martian ocean. We wanted a clean, simple answer to make ourselves feel smart. Instead, we uncovered a mirror, a flawless reflection of our own inescapable future. We are living on a planetary timer. The ground beneath our feet is a temporary bridge, built over an abyss that will eventually swallow everything we have ever known. And as we stare at this terrifying reality, it forces us to ask an incredibly dark question about our own existence and what it truly means to be a temporary passenger on a dying ship. We look up at the stars and we see a canvas of infinite possibilities. We see a playground for future generations. We build rockets, we launch satellites, and we draw maps of other worlds. Completely blinded by the arrogant belief that the universe was made for us to explore and conquer. But the dead rocks of Mars tell a completely different story. They tell us that the universe is not a playground. It is a machine. It is an unthinking, unfeeling assembly line of physics and chemistry that builds complex worlds and then slowly, methodically grinds them back into dust. It does not care about how beautiful an ocean is. It does not care if a planet is perfectly primed for the genesis of biological life. It does not care about our hopes, our struggles, or our desperate desire to leave a legacy. The sheer, crushing weight of deep geological time reduces everything humanity has ever achieved and everything we will ever build to a microscopic footnote. We look at our blue oceans and our green continents, and we see permanence. We see a fortress. We convince ourselves that we are the absolute masters of our environment simply because we have learned how to stack stones and burn ancient carbon. We firmly believe that we are in control. But the truth is, we are absolutely powerless. We are standing on a highly fragile, fractured shell of rock, floating in an ocean of lethal radiation, kept alive only by the temporary heat of a dying internal engine. Every single breath we take, every drop of water we drink, is strictly borrowed time. It is a momentary, highly improbable chemical accident in a cosmos that is actively programmed to erase it. We spend our incredibly brief, fleeting lives fighting over invisible borders drawn on the dirt. We exhaust ourselves obsessing over the daily noise of our own creation. We look at the screens in our hands and we think that is the entire reality of existence, completely ignoring the infinite, terrifying silence of the galaxy waiting just above our incredibly thin atmosphere. But that silence is absolute. It is entirely patient. It is the final destination for every single planet, every single burning star, and every single drop of water in the vast dark. The cold mechanics of the cosmos will always win. It will outlast us all. The fire inside the deep earth will inevitably freeze solid. The massive tectonic conveyor belt will permanently stop moving. The ground will open its microscopic cages, and the deep blue oceans that we firmly thought were our eternal birthright will simply vanish into the dark stone. Our home will inevitably join Mars as a silent monument in the dark, a mummified corpse of a forgotten water world, drifting endlessly around a dying, fading sun. There will be no grand finale. There will be no rescue ship arriving from the stars. There will be no one left to dig up our history. There will be no one left to look at the dry, rusted ruins of our buried cities and wonder what happened to the people who once thought they owned the universe. There will only be the dead rock and the infinite dark.